This podcast focuses on regulatory and corporate developments in highly regulated spaces. I'm Christian Bax, and I used to regulate medical marijuana.
I'm Tony Glover, and I used to regulate alcoholic beverages, casino gaming, and tobacco. Now together, we're regulated. Welcome back to Regulated. This is Tony Glover, and as always, I'm joined by Christian Bax. Bax, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, Tony. How are you doing?
I'm doing all right, all things considered, just surviving, back in quarantine, back in isolation after some fun times out and about a little bit. But, obviously Florida is heading in a certain direction, so we're all just trying to make it.
I'm actually up in Rhode Island right now. So I've, on accident, kind of fallen backward into being in two places that were not hotspots. So, spending the spring in Florida, and then I spent the last a little over a month up northeast doing some work. I've been able to avoid it, so I feel like I'm in a very select minority of the country to be able to just been able to keep living life amid COVID, even though it's certainly changed, which is, something that I think has been a running theme for pretty much every one of our shows since March, which is how COVID has impacted not only our lives, but the regulatory world. I'm sure you're feeling that too as a regulatory lawyer down in Florida right now.
Yeah, especially in sort of the hospitality space and dealing with alcoholic beverages. I mean, I had to go back through all of my law firm blog entries from the past 2 months and add a disclaimer that things are changing rapidly and click here to get the newest articles because, anything you read from a date and time is just a reflection of what's going on right then. There's so many things changing so quickly. You never know exactly what's the most current information unless you double check it.
Right. How long did we actually have bars open in Florida for? Like 2 weeks?
Well, that's a more complicated question than it sounds. Because, there's no statutory definition of a quote unquote bar in Florida law. So, is a Ruby Tuesdays a bar, which is, you could argue that's a family restaurant that incidentally happens to sell alcoholic beverages and has a wooden structure that resembles a bar in one corner of it. Right. So, technically speaking, right now you could go sit at a bar, and that's as of 11:33 a.m. on July 13th, right? You could technically go sit at a bar and eat food and enjoy a beverage as long as you're appropriately socially distanced. So, I saw some pictures from over the weekend, both protest related and party related pictures. People crowded in at different venues across the state. For some reason, it seems to be clustered in Central Florida and of course in other jurisdictions as well. But, looking at Florida law, and I suspect that many of those places are going to hear from our friends at the Division of Alcoholic Beverages and Tobacco. So technically, you can go sit at a bar, quote unquote, and enjoy a beverage, but there are some very severe limitations in place as to, how much socializing you're supposed to be able to do.
So speaking of socializing, and not to grind the gears too aggressively to kind of get into today's topic. So like I said, I'm up in New England right now, and one of my best friends, who is also a show contributor, Dylan Conley, is running for Congress up in Rhode Island in District 2. So I've been following the actual election process and this election cycle a little bit closer than I normally do as far as the actual mechanics of being elected. And I really can't understate how impactful COVID has been on elections. And I know we talk about that, but I wanted to do a deep dive because for me, there's so many things that I hadn't really thought of intuitively as to how COVID would impact our lives as far as who we elect to public office. Just as a talking point, something I was talking to somebody the other day is, the two actions that we most stereotypically associate with the quote politician is shaking hands and kissing babies, right? Two things you literally can't do right now. You can't even really take group photos with strangers anymore. And that's basically a politician's job, is to go out during an election cycle and get to know the community, go to as many community events as possible. That's how they raise money, which is how they get up on social media ads, how they get up on TV, how they get up on radio. And all of that has kind of ground to a halt because I worked on congressional campaigns back in 2012, and you didn't have weekends. Every weekend you were going to 3 or 4 different community events. And during the week you were doing fundraisers, or you were doing, you were door knocking and you're canvassing, or, you were in a call center and you were elbow to elbow with 20 other people calling people about your candidate. None of those things are possible right now. And so the most specific and interesting thing I've seen from a regulatory perspective is the signature requirements for people, actual people, to get on primary ballots in order to run for office in the country.
Well, Christian, just thinking about political campaigns, and it's, again, it's mid-July here in North Florida. I'm I'm gonna break out in hives. There's nothing I would like to do less than walk around Tallahassee or Jacksonville in the summertime and knock on doors. So, shout out to all those interns and volunteers that are getting to stay in the air-conditioned, confines of their living room and do Zoom calls or conference calls or teleworking. That seems like a better solution than the old days.
I would say this may be the most detached, through no fault of their own, but the most detached candidates for office have ever been from their constituency, in a very real, like, physical sense, because candidates all over the country, like basically everybody, are trying to do Zoom calls and are trying to do community roundtables and do this online, but there's something that you miss from actually being able to look other people in the eye, shake their hands, talk to people. I'd say it's like the difference between working out on like a bench press machine and like doing Olympic lifting, right? As far as your muscles. So like when you're on a Zoom, you're very targeted. You don't have a lot of things coming at you. There's not a lot of variables, and you kind of are focused in on this one thing. But when you're actually out like in a three-dimensional space interacting with a couple hundred people who could potentially vote for you, like you could ask so many random things. You have to respond to so many different issues that just people randomly ask you, and people also, because of that randomness and because they actually get to see you in person, people kind of get a feel for you. So, so it's like that Maya Angelou quote where people don't really remember what you say or what you do. They remember how they made you feel. So when you lose that proximity, it makes the soft parts of politics more difficult. But the actual functional, like constitutional and statutorily required parts of running for office are also ramped up by a significant degree. The story I've been following in Rhode Island, back on June 11th, there was an attempt to reduce signature gathering requirements for 50% to get on the ballot in Rhode Island. That was basically petitioned to the Rhode Island Board of Elections, who voted 4-3 to not recommend to the legislature to reduce the amount of signature requirements by 50%. These people are basically saying, okay, Board of Elections, we have these requirements. And if you don't know at home, in order to get on the ballot, you can't just like sign up and say, hey, I'm Christian Baxter, I'm Tony Glover, and I want to run in this party's primary to be in the general in November. You have to actually get slips of paper exactly how you had to do in high school or if you ran for office in college, where you literally get people's names, addresses, and signatures.
Right.
And they literally sign a petition that you submit to your board of canvassers. Usually you're submitting to each of the local governments. Some states you submit them all directly to the Secretary of State. And that's how you get on the ballot. You have to physically go in front of people, hand them a pen, and say, please sign your name on this piece of paper, acknowledging that you would like to see me on a ballot. Obviously, that's not a great idea right now. Because people are super reticent to take your used pen from you. People don't want to answer their door to strangers who are going door to door. But also from the canvasser's perspective, if you're out getting signatures, you're exposing yourself to hundreds, perhaps thousands of people who you don't know. I mean, you're trying to do right by your candidate and get them on the ballot. But A, it's very unsafe for you if you don't want to be getting COVID. But B, you now become a vector for contamination. Not just if you become symptomatic, but after all we've seen about people and their ability to spread when they're asymptomatic, it's really problematic. And so everybody was just kind of like, Board of Elections, are you kidding me? 4-3, you're not even going to recommend that you reduce by 50% the amount of signatures that the people need on the ballot. But luckily, so the legislature in Rhode Island did it anyway. But that got me kind of looking, and this has been a problem everywhere. So there was July 13th, there's a story out of Colorado where Governor Jared Polis tried to limit in-person contact for the election process by executive order, and business groups in the University of Denver Chancellor Emeritus, Dan Ritchie, sued him and got parts of that executive order overturned because the signature requirement parts of it were constitutional and parts of it statutory. And as governor, he doesn't have the authority to just waive those requirements. So it's kind of like these cemented, embedded things that there's no firewall. There's no way to short circuit the process when we have an emergency like this.
Yeah, and it's been interesting to watch this on a state-by-state basis, and I know we'll go into this a little bit, but these rules derive from different places depending on the state. In some states, it's mostly statutory. In some states, it's mostly constitutional. And in some states, it's a mix, like what you described. So it's interesting to watch how the courts deal with this and how much leeway they have in different jurisdictions.
That's why I wanted to talk about Rhode Island, because Rhode Island has all three. Advocates went through the Board of Canvassers. They tried to get the Board of Canvassers to just reach out to the legislature and say, hey, this is a problem. Let's switch it up for this cycle and solve it. And the Board of Canvassers refused to change anything. And it wasn't clear that the idea was going to get traction in the legislature. So rewind back to June, Rhode Island candidates sued to change the ballot signature rule amid pandemic. I mean, basically their claim was exactly what we talked about. Candidates should not face the impossible choice of risking infection to themselves, their families, to others in order to appear on the ballot, nor should their supporters. So the U.S. District Court, Judge Mary McElroy, she said, yeah, absolutely. There's no compelling interest in forcing candidates for public office, particularly those who are elderly or have underlying health conditions, to solicit signatures in person in a pandemic. And what was great is she obviously, lawyers from the state don't always, personally believe in the positions they take. Sometimes you just have to do it because you're defending the law, and it's your job to defend the law, even if the law is stupid. When the state pushed back, the judge is like, you guys realize we're holding this hearing on a Zoom call, right? The reason we're doing this is patently obvious. It's because it's unsafe for us, this little group here, to meet to discuss this very important issue. Like, it's very clear that it's not important enough to be sending people out into their communities to the degree that you currently required. So they kind of split the baby a little bit in the sense that the legislature came back and the legislature reduced the signature requirement by 50%. If you typically needed 1,000 signatures to get on the ballot, you now only need 500, and they allowed for emails for you to basically be able to send out these petitions to residents in your jurisdiction. They can sign it, they can take a picture, scan it, send it back. That's still a problem.
Which I would never do.
Right.
I would never, unless it was a personal friend, right? A close connection who was running for office in my state. I would never get a random email from a candidate. And of course, I get a ton of them, right? I get a ton of fundraising emails, and then print something out, sign it, and scan it back. It's just not happening for Joe Blow and HD whatever. It's just never going to happen.
Right. And it's a problem. The incumbency advantage to this particular situation is insanely high. Specifically, if you look at a state like Rhode Island, where to get on the ballot, you typically need in the hundreds. So you need 500 signatures, right? You compare that to a state like Florida, where to run for Congress, you need 6,000 signatures, depending on the district. Or, even to run for state house or state senate, you need 3,000 or 4,000 signatures from constituents. There's frequently windows of time that attach to these, so they're temporal. So you get, maybe a couple weeks in order to get these signatures done and turned back in so that you can appear on the primary ballot. One person, one candidate alone who just has great ideas and wants to get on the ballot, you absolutely cannot do that. So you either have to pay people to do it, or you just have to have an amazing support network that's really willing to go out there and do it for you. Because the candidates have built-in advantages, right? So the incumbents have built-in advantages. The parties have the mechanisms to be able to go out and to use the party infrastructure to basically just hammer out the bare minimum in order to get on the ballot.
And plus they have lists, they have email lists, they have phone lists, they have people that they know are engaged at a certain level, frequent voters, people that have signed up on their website.
Right.
So in terms of if you need to find 500 people in a pinch, you don't have to start from scratch if you're working with a party.
Right. And and it's not a simple kind of one-to-one causality here either, because if you think about fundraising, it's very hard to raise money politically right now. We've seen a pretty prominent recent story in Florida having to do with the Republican National Convention. Even there's some tough sledding raising money for something that's usually very easy to raise money for. Now you apply that to people who aren't incumbents, who would normally just be having a friends and family barbecue in their backyard to raise $2,000 or $3,000 to be able to hire a part-time campaign manager or, pay some interns to go out to Publix and get signatures. I mean, my friend Dylan, the guy who's running for Congress, he literally would get up in the morning and like drive down to the beach and just like walk down the beach and try to find. I mean, it was just like talking to constituents because it was 4th of July weekend, right? That's where people were, and people were cool about it. You talk to them, not everybody is so, you get a lot of not rude people, but a lot of scared people who don't want you to come within 6 feet of them.
Well, that's what I don't understand. I see these confrontations. I'm not getting within 6 feet of anybody. It's just not happening, right? I'm not talking to anybody. I'm not having a palaver. I'm not having a negotiation. So when I see on social media, there's been all these disagreements, let's call them, between patrons in grocery stores and different retail outlets across the country. And I'm not fighting anybody about the mask. I'm staying the hell away from them. You know what I mean? And that goes double for a petition seeker. I'm not stopping to talk to you. It's not happening. Not until we have a vaccine. So yeah, it's tough.
So your worst case scenario is basically you have 4 or 5 people who would be running for an office because they don't have to go through that very mundane chore of just going out and getting signatures. The alternative is you basically automatically enroll all of the incumbents on the ballot by fiat because they have structural ways in order to handle the signature requirement. And you create this huge barrier to entry for anyone who wants to challenge an incumbent, and which, given kind of the amount of issues that are currently on the table, seems crazy. But I think it's also, I don't like to use this term, I think it's un-American. I think that the way the republic is set up, the way our election system is set up, it's so that anyone can run for office. And when you basically make like a physical signature requirement that is going to cause a lot of people not to be able to qualify. When you balance those two things, I think you clearly err on the side of democracy, and you do whatever you can to make the signature requirement as lax and as low as possible. And for this cycle, you err on the side of allowing candidates to get on the ballot rather than squeezing them out because of this requirement that really doesn't have any, I think, real link to whether or not a candidate would be a productive, good candidate on the ballot.
Right. And look, policymakers have to look at this time period as a once in a lifetime, sort of a once in the career opportunity to relax a little bit. Nobody's going to be remembered for being too concerned about the public health and welfare. Historically, people aren't going to look back and say, damn it, in 2020, we cut the signature requirement by 50 or 75%. And look at this, to use your term, parade of horribles that followed that. It's just not going to happen. So let's use common sense and think about the policy implications of the policies we're implementing, right? Why are we requiring these signatures? What's the actual policy objective there? And is there a less dangerous method by which we can get to where we want to be?
What has your impression been of like Zoom meetings? Have you attended any of these community events that normally would be in person or like forums or
like a hearing or something along those lines?
Virtual? Yeah, I mean, I guess hearing, but I was more talking about we've had the candidate town halls where I guess they've been a part of politics in America forever, but for some reason I remember them really kind of exploding around 2010. I think it's because there just seemed to be a lot of friction that candidates were getting at their respective town halls. But now all those things have been moved virtually, right? So now they're just they're all basically either webinars or they're on Zoom.
I've got a secret a secret Zoom strategy, which is I never use the Zoom app for business. I always just call in on my cell phone. So I'm always the audio only guy on Zoom. And, I haven't been disrupted that much in terms of my working habits because most of the hearings that I attend have been, with the Department of Business and Professional Regulation here in Florida. And they've been great for years about having teleconference options on their meetings because they meet across the state from West Palm Beach to Orlando to Pensacola to Jacksonville. They're liable to have a board meeting. So they've always had teleconference lines and I've always called in or almost always called in. So really the disruption has been minimal on my part, but I'm lucky. I have not had to sit in on like a city of Tallahassee, sort of town hall type meeting with 400 people, on the line.
So my best friend Jeko, who I talk about every now and then, he's the Bulgarian guy who lives in London now. So he's got a very, very like corporate job that requires him to be on Zoom a lot. And he showed me that he and his buddy figured out a way to record him looking at the computer screen and run it in a loop, so it's as his background. And so it's like a hologram of him basically sitting there paying attention on a Zoom while he's like carrying around his infant kid, or he's like making himself breakfast, doing his laundry. Like it visually appears that he's on the Zoom meeting. But okay, so can I tell you, I haven't had a Zoom hearing. My best virtual hearing story, though, is so back when I was with the state towards the end, when we were dealing with a fair amount of litigation, one particularly colorful litigant in particular, we had this like remote deposition. And so his lawyers were all down in one city and my lawyers were all in, the conference room in Tallahassee with me. And you could like hear the client just like cursing in the background, like anytime you gave an answer that he didn't like, you could just freaking, the stenographer, right? The woman whose job was to basically transcribe the entire meeting. You could tell that she's just like appalled because she didn't know whether or not she was supposed to write down the profanity coming through the phone.
Well, this is a continued digression, but I won't directly address what happened, but I will reference it if you want to do your own research, because it's not necessarily safe for work. But there was a legal hearing in Tallahassee last week related to the mask ordinance that the city commission had passed, brought by a conservative state representative. He was serving as the attorney in the case. And there were a number of, shall we say, entertaining disruptions in the course of that Zoom meeting. And I don't know how it happened, but they are posted on Twitter. If you Google it, you'll find it. Again, not safe for work. So, proceed with caution.
Yeah, and that was something that we talked about with Bradley Tusk, which is, as we move into this post-Zoom world, that is a thing. Like, people are going to post that kind of naughty stuff just because people on the internet are completely irresponsible. And by the way, if you are at all interested, you can either Google that or you can just check out Eric Sarkeesian's on Twitter. He posted some screenshots and was tweeting about it fairly prolifically. That's where I got the information from. Kind of bringing it full circle, my hypothesis was always that this was going to absolutely crush anyone trying to get any kind of initiative on the ballot. But I don't think that that's true, because I've been reading there's a fair amount of initiatives that are still able to maintain their momentum somehow through COVID. What have you seen in that world?
Well, yeah, even though we've talked about some of the difficulties that we see in this, there are some organizers that are succeeding in 2020 on getting on the ballot. And there are some that are deciding that 2022 or 2024 is a better option. Just wait and see what happens with the pandemic. But this is from Marijuana Moment. Tom Engel, their editor-in-chief, wrote this piece. Oregon officials announced on Wednesday that the state's voters will get a chance to decide whether to pass a first-of-its-kind measure to legalize psilocybin for therapeutic use in November. Of course, psilocybin is the active ingredient in quote-unquote magic mushrooms. This is on top of another far-reaching drug policy reform question that will be on the ballot, which is a separate initiative to decriminalize low-level drug possession, which was qualified last week. I thought the psilocybin campaign was pretty interesting because they collected, get this number, over 132,000 signatures from registered voters. And that exceeds the 112,000 needed to qualify by a comfortable margin. So I guess people in Oregon are interested enough in magic mushrooms, or perhaps I should say the organizers of this effort in Oregon are organized enough to generate that interest and capture it in such a manner to get over 130,000 signatures. So that's moving there. Of course, that follows Denver, which became the first place to deprioritize enforcement of laws against psilocybin last year, and then the Oakland City Council. So obviously we're moving from cities and sort of counties to states, which is a big deal. Colorado was pursuing a ballot measure for 2020, but they've pushed that until 2022. But there are several other jurisdictions that continue to move forward with this effort.
How do you think that this is possible?
Well, I've got three more data points for you, and then maybe a conclusion we can draw from this, which is, so in Arizona, they turned in 420,000 signatures to qualify for the ballot. That was also last week. In Nebraska, organizers submitted 182 signatures. This was on a medical marijuana measure that looks like it will likely be on the ballot in November.
182 or 182,000?
So 182,000.
Okay, gotcha.
And then in Montana, they turned in more than 130,000 signatures, and that's for a pair of marijuana legalization initiatives, also for the November 2020 ballot. So my conclusion is, and we've opined and sort of contemplated this idea, thoughts about the organizers behind these measures before and talked about the strategy. But I think what it shows is, as drug policy organizers and campaigners have continued to work and continued to find success around the country. I mean, you look at the way the tide has turned in the past 15 years. I think what you're seeing is that they're getting better, right? They're learning from past battles. There's a professionalization that's happening in the organizer ranks. And frankly, these people are just damn good at their jobs now, compared to 10 years ago. And these people are kind of at the top of their game. So how do they do it? My official answer, I guess the organizers have gotten better and they're good at their job. But beyond that, in terms of details, I don't know. I don't know how they were able to pull together some of these numbers, which are eye-popping.
I have to believe a lot of these signatures came before March, or at least before April, that they've probably been able to continue to do stuff through the spring and early summer. But, usually you've got 2 years to do these things. I have to imagine they got a nice chunk before March. The second is I would imagine they're getting very good at targeting. So they've got lists, and, just any basic political campaign, you can buy software to be able to drill down on data about specific voters, about how they vote, what they prioritize based on other, variables, what kind of car they drive, what kind of neighborhood they live in. You can be predictive about how they feel about certain issues. And I'm sure there are people who we may have never heard of who are very, very good at figuring out exactly who an electorate would specifically support these drug referendums, and then getting petitions in front of those specific people. And they probably have a really high success rate and are very efficient with those types of people.
Well, it might be a good follow-up for this. Maybe we should try to identify one of those folks and have them on to opine and share some of their strategy on this. But look, we talked about how Colorado, the psilocybin campaigners, have pushed their effort back to 2022. It hasn't been universal success, right, for signature gatherers, because in Mississippi, there's a medical marijuana initiative. They're pushing back because it's just going to be too difficult. Same thing, a legalization effort in Missouri, in North Dakota, and then also a decriminalization effort, sort of a broader drug decriminalization and treatment effort in Washington State is also pushing back, and they're going to target the legislature instead of trying to go through the signature and ballot process, just due to the realities of campaigning, both initially to get on the ballot and then to win the damn thing. So yeah, it's difficult. There's probably reasons why we're seeing success in different states and not others, that are either depending on how strong the movement is or also on how forgiving the local regulations are.
Tony, do you think moving forward that we're going to see any fundamental or permanent changes to the way we think about elections, or kind of the structural process of getting elected post-COVID?
Absolutely. And I don't think that it's a necessarily complete sea change. What I think it is hastening our evolution. So, full disclosure, my political career has been entirely in Florida, which is now the third largest state. It's a large state geographically. It's a diverse state. And frankly, it's hard to get from Miami to Pensacola in a car or on a plane. So what we've seen in Florida over the past 10 years is an increased spending on television. Florida in some respects has turned into an air war state in terms of campaigning. And I think Florida is kind of a canary in the coal mine, so to speak, or at least an early indicator, to use a better term, of where the rest of the country is going. And so if you pull back on some of the traditional things that used to be important, going to the Yamasee County Skunk Festival or whatever event is popular in your state, where, the uncomfortable state Senate candidates have to stand around and, at some festival outside of their district.
Goat Day.
right.
Goat Day.
You're at the Worm Festival or whatever nonsense is popular.
No, it's a real thing. Yeah.
Oh no, I know that one's real. What's the one in Florida? Remind me. Is it the Raccoon Festival?
There's a goat day. There's a possum festival.
Possum festival.
Where the candidates actually hold the possums by the tail. It's freaking weird. No offense to the people who love Possum Day.
Well, right. Well, so my takeaway from the past 10 years before COVID is that we're moving away from possums, right? And we're moving towards sophisticated online and on-air campaigns that are drawn off of large campaign donations, correct? I think we're still moving in that direction, but you add in the additional accelerant of not wanting to touch anybody's hand and not wanting to be in a small room and not being able to kiss a baby. You know, you're a 65-year-old candidate. You shouldn't be out here kissing anybody, just from a safety standpoint. So I think it's just an accelerant on where we're already heading. I think it's going to be more TV. It's going to be more web-based and probably heavy on the web going forward, social media, things of that nature.
Yeah, I really like the last point you made because, you know, TV has been the biggest cost driver for a lot of campaigns. It's very expensive to get up on TV, but it was also it's probably the best way to reach a lot of voters quickly. But what's interesting is, you know, a lot of people aren't watching traditional cable TV right now, A, because they were already cutting cords, but B, now the content's just not there. There's nothing new. And so, you know, you got a lot of people who are migrating over to these streaming services just for fresh content, but who aren't necessarily part of that same ad buy that your comms person, you know, would be going through in order to get your commercials up on air for traditional TV. And so another thing with social media has been really interesting is how big of a role influencers have played this cycle, where, you know, every candidate out there is like, what influencers do we know? What influencers in the district? How can we get these influencers to be kind of part of the campaign to drive those very valuable social media metrics and get, you know, shares and likes, additional follows on social media? I think this campaign has really accelerated the role of as sick and disgusting as I think it is, the role of the social media influencer in American politics.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if TikTok is still around in 2022, TikTok will probably be a big part of our election.
When are we doing our TikTok episode about how that may get banned by the U.S.?
there definitely will be some opportunities, and maybe we should grab somebody from the FCC sphere to come chat with us.
Did you see that? So both the Republicans and the Democrats are telling their campaign staffers, do not download TikTok on your phone.
Well, look, I'm not downloading TikTok on my phone, and you know, part of that's because I'm a washed up, you know, 36-year-old dad. But the other part of that is because of privacy concerns. So
I'd like to do a show on this. If you don't know what we're talking about, I don't want to get sued. So just Google TikTok and privacy concerns, and you'll see exactly what we're talking about. All right, Tony, do you have any shout-outs for the week?
You know, I just want to shout out everybody who's staying safe. I drove out to a national park down in Palatka this weekend, Ravine Gardens State Park. It's a beautiful place. Unfortunately, 80% of it is closed, so don't visit this summer. But on my way back, I had to stop into a gas station. I prefer not to, but I did. And I go in, and there's about 8 people in the store, 2 of them being employees, the remaining being, you know, customers, and then myself. And I was the only person wearing a mask. So I say all that to say this. Shout out to all the people who are wearing a mask, staying safe, doing it for themselves, but also doing it for other people that they don't know that they're encounter at the supermarket, the Harris Teeter, the Publix, the Wegmans. Shout out to them.
Yeah, for me, so shout out to show contributor Dylan Conley for his congressional run. It's been very cool to watch his campaign ramp up. And I'd say, you know, shout out to the doctors who just are going to continue to be on the front lines for the next few months and help us get through this as safely as we can.
Well, with all that said, do you want to send us out, Christian?
Yes, ladies and gentlemen, look for more regulated in the weeks to come. And as always, stay compliant.